The first tremor, the faint presage of the coming storm, was almost laughably mundane, a crisp, cream-colored envelope tucked under the wiper blade of my truck, its contents informing me that my fishing line, cast from the small, weathered dock I'd rebuilt with my own hands, constituted a violation of community waterway aesthetics, a $50 fine. Brenda K. Karen was too gentle a euphemism for the woman who signed herself Brenda Koenig, President, Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association, apparently considered the rhythmic flick of my wrist, the patient arc of the line, an affront to her meticulously curated vision of suburban placidity. I paid it. I paid it with the weary sigh of a man who has learned that some skirmishes are best conceded to conserve resources for the wars that truly matter. My daughter, Lily, then 7, had watched Brenda, a woman whose face seemed permanently set in a rictus of pinched disapproval, march down the common access path that skirted the edge of my property, her sensible heels digging into the grass with punitive force to plant her little flag of officious nonsense. Lily had asked why the frowny lady didn't like my fishing. I told her, some people just didn't understand the quiet music of a lure hitting water. The lake, you see, wasn't just a lake. It was my lake. Not in some poetic, possessive sense, but in the stark, unyielding language of deeds and surveys that stretched back 3 generations. A legacy of land acquired when this whole area was nothing but scrub pine and ambition. My grandfather had bought the entire basin, the water, the land beneath it, and a generous apron of shoreline, long before Lakeside Estates was a gleam in a developer's eye. The developer had, in fact, purchased the surrounding acreage from my father, with explicit, ironclad covenants ensuring our continued, unimpeded ownership and use of the lake itself. Lakeside Estates had usage rights to a small designated beach and boat ramp on the far eastern shore, nothing more. The rest, including the water lapping at the edge of their manicured lawns, was mine. Brenda Koenig, in her zeal, seemed to have conveniently forgotten this, or more likely had never bothered to learn it. Her reign was one of petty tyrannies, the precise shade of one's mailbox, the allowable height of decorative grasses, the unspeakable vulgarity of a child's brightly colored bicycle left momentarily unattended in a driveway. The lake, my lake, was her new frontier. The $50 fine was followed by a $100 penalty for unapproved shoreline modification when I reinforced a small section of bank with natural stone to prevent erosion after a heavy storm. Then came the warnings about the type of boat I used, a simple, unmotorized skiff, allegedly not conforming to some imaginary HOA standard for watercraft presentation. Each notice, each meticulously worded piece of bureaucratic bile, I archived. Digital scans, hard copies, dates, times, method of delivery. A habit ingrained from a former life where documentation was the difference between vindication and oblivion. My wife, Sarah, a pragmatic soul with a lawyer's mind honed in corporate litigation before she chose peace over billable hours, watched my growing file with a mixture of amusement and concern. "You're building a case," she'd observed, "but against whom and for what?" I hadn't known then, not really. I only knew that the pressure was building, a slow, tectonic creep of unreasonableness against the bedrock of my rights. The drone was my idea. A small, unobtrusive model, ostensibly for capturing scenic shots of the changing seasons across the water. Its true purpose was observation, a silent, digital sentry. Brenda had a habit of taking inspection tours along the lake path, often veering suspiciously close to my property line, her phone camera active. My drone recorded her recordings. It was, I suppose, the first, almost subconscious, step in a tactical preparation I hadn't yet fully acknowledged. The sheer audacity of fining me for fishing in my own lake was one thing. The cloying, self-righteous certainty with which she did it was another. It spoke of a profound disconnect from reality, a dangerous level of entitlement, and it was escalating. Each paid fine, each quietly ignored warning seemed only to embolden her. She mistook my patience for weakness, my silence for acquiescence. It was a common mistake people made. The quiet ones are often the most dangerous when finally roused. They've had more time to think. The letter that finally broke the dam of my forbearance wasn't cream-colored. It was a stark, angry red, delivered by certified mail, requiring a signature, a deliberate piece of performative intimidation. Inside, the language had escalated from officious to outright predatory. Final notice: accumulated violations and penalties. It listed every perceived infraction from the past 18 months: fishing, the skiff, the stones, even a ludicrous claim about unauthorized waterfowl congregation, because some ducks had taken a liking to my quiet cove. Each was attached to an exponentially inflated fine, culminating in a breathtaking demand for $180,000. $180,000 for fishing in my own lake, for existing, it seemed, in a way that displeased Brenda Koenig. She had even included blurry, pixelated photographs, probably taken with her phone from the path, as evidence. My skiff looked like a shadowy blot. The stones were just rocks. The fishing line was an invisible accusation. Lily found me staring at it. The red envelope, a poisonous bloom on my antique oak desk. The usual calm I projected, the quiet assurance that was my default setting, must have fractured, because her small hand crept into mine, her brow furrowed with a child's profound, uncomplicated empathy. "Is it the frowny lady again, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small. I looked from the outrageous demand in my hand to my daughter's innocent face, and something cold and hard coalesced in my chest. This wasn't about aesthetics or regulations anymore. This was a violation, a predatory incursion into my life, my finances, an attempt to extort, to dominate through sheer, unadulterated audacity. The sum was clearly designed to be crippling, to force a capitulation or a ruinous legal battle they assumed I couldn't afford or wouldn't risk. They crossed the line. They crossed it, trampled it, and then set it on fire. Sarah read the letter, her expression shifting from disbelief to a glacial fury that mirrored my own, though hers was always more elegantly expressed. "This isn't just overreach, Mark," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "This is malicious prosecution. This is unhinged." She tapped the signature. "Brenda Koenig. She's going to learn about due diligence the hard way." The HOA, in its infinite wisdom, or rather Brenda's singular obsession, had weaponized bureaucracy. They'd mistaken my quiet enjoyment of my legacy for a vulnerability. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know what I was capable of when stirred from my deliberate peace. The military had taught me many things: strategic planning, the value of intelligence, the overwhelming application of force to achieve a clear objective. And above all, it taught me that some lines, once crossed, demand an absolute response. This was such a line. The 180 wasn't a fine, it was a declaration of war. And Brenda Koenig had just handed me the casus belli on a silver platter, or rather, in a blood-red envelope. My internal monologue, usually a calm stream of consciousness, became a tactical briefing. Objective: neutralize threat, eliminate hostile actors' capacity to inflict further harm. Method: legal, precise, and utterly devastating. The cold anger was a clean fuel, burning away any previous inclination towards compromise. They had threatened my family's security, my heritage. There would be no more quiet payment of nuisance fees. There would be a reckoning. The visual of Brenda's smug, pinched face, the memory of her trespassing to deliver her petty edicts, the sheer gall of that 180 demand, it all sharpened my resolve to a razor's edge. The drone footage, previously just a passive record, now became active intelligence. Her patterns, her routines, her interactions with other residents, it was all data. The war had begun, not with a bang, but with the rustle of a single outrageous letter. And I, the reluctant warrior, was now fully awake. The old survey maps were stored in a fireproof safe in my study, rolled tight in cardboard tubes, their paper brittle with age, but the ink still sharp and definitive. My grandfather's careful hand had made annotations in the margins, noting boundary markers, water depths, even the locations of submerged springs. I unrolled them across the vast surface of my desk, the scent of old paper and history filling the room. There it was, clear as day, Lot 1. Encompassing the entirety of Whisperwind Lake, its bed, its banks, and a 50-foot perimeter buffer. Our residential plot was a subdivision of this original Lot 1. Lakeside Estates was adjacent, their property lines ending precisely where my much larger, older claim began. Sully, retired county surveyor, my fishing buddy from before my family inherited this land, arrived with his own more modern GPS equipment and a gleam in his eye. He'd heard whispers of Brenda's reign of terror from mutual acquaintances. "Heard you got a Koenig-size problem," he'd said over the phone, his voice crackling with dry amusement. "Figured you might need someone who can tell a boundary stake from a badger hole." He spent 2 days with me, walking the perimeter, cross-referencing the old maps with satellite data and his precision GPS. He confirmed every inch. "Solid as a rock, Mark," he declared, slapping a newly planted, bright orange survey flag into the earth, at a critical junction where the HOA's manicured community green space bled almost imperceptibly onto my land. "This lake is yours, lock, stock, and water column. They've got access to that beach on the east side, per the plat, and that's it. Anything else, they're trespassing." My lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne, was cut from a different cloth than Sarah. Where she was elegant fire, he was polished ice. Ex-JAG, with a mind like a steel trap and a courtroom demeanor that could make opposing counsel weep. I laid out the history, the deeds, Sully's fresh survey, the stack of violation notices, and finally, the 180-0 demand. Thorne listened, his steepled fingers occasionally tapping together, his eyes the color of a winter sky, missing nothing. He examined the red envelope with a faint, carnivorous smile. "Ms. Koenig," he said, his voice a soft purr that nevertheless promised evisceration, "appears to be operating under a charmingly Napoleonic delusion of grandeur. This isn't just harassment. It's attempted extortion, possibly fraud if she's misrepresenting HOA authority for personal leverage, which, given the sum, is a distinct possibility we'll explore during discovery." The plan began to crystallize, not in a rush of emotion, but with the cold, methodical precision of a military campaign. Phase 1. Establish undeniable truth. Formal, legally unimpeachable notification. Phase 2. Secure the border. Physical assertion of property rights. Phase 3. Counter. Offensive. Dismantle their claims, reclaim my peace, and ensure this could never happen again. Thorne's first action was to draft a cease and desist letter to Brenda Koenig personally for harassment and defamation sent to her home address, not the HOA. "We addressed the organ grinder, not the monkey," he'd quipped, a rare flash of dry humor. Simultaneously, a comprehensive package was prepared for the HOA Board of Directors. It included certified copies of the original deeds, Sully's new survey plat map highlighted to show the exact boundaries of my property, the entire lake and its immediate surrounds, a legal opinion on my unequivocal water rights, and a formal demand for the immediate withdrawal of all outstanding fines and a public apology. A copy was also sent to the HOA's registered legal counsel, a small local firm that probably handled slip and falls and uncontested divorces, not complex property law against a determined adversary. The inner monologue was now a checklist. Research complete, legal counsel engaged, initial strategy defined. The drone became less about observing Brenda and more about documenting the existing state of the HOA's casual encroachment, the little sitting spots they'd established on my land, the unpermitted fishing piers some residents had dared to erect, the way their landscapers routinely mowed a 10-foot strip of my property along the path as if it were theirs. Evidence. Ammunition. Sarah watched me, a new respect in her eyes. "You've been quiet about this part of your past," she said one evening, gesturing to the maps and legal drafts. "The methodical part, the part that doesn't back down." I merely nodded. Some skills, once learned, never truly go dormant. They just wait. The HOA had, for years, operated on assumption and aggression. They were about to collide with documented fact and surgical execution. The silence from their end after Thorne's packages were delivered was telling. It was the silence of confusion, perhaps dawning horror, as the flimsy edifice of their assumed authority began to tremble. Brenda, I imagined, was furious. But even her bluster would struggle against the weight of deeded history. The beauty of the plan was its reliance on undeniable truth. I wasn't bending laws, I was enforcing them. My rights, long passively held, were about to become actively, and for them, painfully, asserted. The stage was set. The pieces were in motion. The first shot in this quiet war was not a bullet, but the heavy thud of registered mail on unprepared desks. The HOA board meeting, convened hastily a week after Thorne's salvo of legal documents landed, was, by all accounts, relayed to me by a now deeply concerned and suddenly communicative neighbor, an exercise in pandemonium. Brenda Koenig, predictably, had attempted to dismiss the entire matter as a frivolous tactic by a disgruntled resident. "He's just trying to intimidate us. He can't possibly own the lake," she'd reportedly thundered, her face modeling an unbecoming shade of puce. But the weight of the meticulously prepared deeds, the stark clarity of Sully's survey map, which Thorne had thoughtfully included in large, easy-to-read format for each board member, had a sobering effect on the less fanatical members. Two of them, a retired accountant and a civil engineer, actually understood how to read such documents. Their unease was palpable. My neighbor, a quiet woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had once apologized profusely when her grandson's toy boat drifted into my reeds, described Brenda's growing agitation as the accountant began asking pointed questions about due diligence and the HOA's historical understanding of its own boundaries. She just kept repeating that the lake was for the community, Mrs. Henderson recounted, her voice hushed over the phone, as if saying it enough times would make it true. The HOA's legal counsel, a flustered young man clearly out of his depth, had apparently advised caution and a thorough review, a suggestion Brenda had loudly derided as weak-kneed. The official response from the HOA, when it finally came a week later, was a masterpiece of blustering ambiguity. It acknowledged receipt of my correspondence, but arrogantly reasserted their historic rights and oversight concerning the community waterway known as Lakeside Estates Lake. They didn't specifically refute my deeds, but implied they were misinterpreted or superseded by some vague notion of community custom and expectation. They did not withdraw the fines. They did not apologize. They essentially doubled down, albeit with a slightly less confident tone. Thorne chuckled when he read it. "Amateurs," he said, the word dripping with contempt. "They're trying to play poker with a monopoly money hand." "Right, Phase 2 then, Mark." Phase 2 was the fence. Not a decorative picket fence, but a serious 6-foot galvanized chain-link barrier, the kind that means business. The kind that screams, "this far and no further." The kind that is, incidentally, entirely permissible on one's own property. Sully had already marked the exact property line with survey stakes every 20 feet. A bright orange trail snaking around the entire lake perimeter, carefully excluding only the deeded HOA beach and boat ramp area on the far eastern shore. The fence company I hired was efficient and professional. They started at dawn on a Monday. The clang of post drivers, the whine of tensioning tools, the methodical unspooling of chain link became the new soundtrack of Lakeside Estates. By lunchtime, the first 100 yards were up, a gleaming silver demarcation against the green of the grass and the blue of the water. My drone, now overtly recording for security purposes, captured the reactions beautifully. Brenda Koenig arrived mid-morning, her face a thundercloud. She accosted the foreman, a burly man named Gus, who'd seen his share of boundary disputes and was utterly unmoved. Drone audio picked up her shrill demands. "You can't do this. This is community property. I order you to stop." Gus, bless his stoic heart, simply pointed to the survey stakes and then to the copy of the work order, which included a notarized letter of authorization from me, citing my deed and plat number. "Ma'am," he rumbled, "I'm contracted to build a fence on Mr. Markinson's property. These stakes show his line. Unless you have a court order saying otherwise, we continue." She sputtered, threatened lawsuits, threatened to call the sheriff. The sheriff, in fact, did make a courtesy call later that day, summoned by a frantic Brenda. 2 deputies ambled up, listened patiently to her tirade, then came over to where I was observing from my porch. I showed them my deeds, Sully's fresh survey, a copy of Thorne's letter to the HOA. One of the deputies, a grizzled veteran, nodded slowly. "Looks like his land, Brenda," he said. Not unkindly, but firmly. "He can put up a fence if he wants, long as it's on his side of the line and meets county code, which this appears to." Her face crumpled. It was a glorious sight, captured in high definition. The fence was a stark, undeniable visual. It physically cut off the casual, assumed access the residents had enjoyed for years, the little paths worn to the water's edge, the spots where they'd launch kayaks, the stretches of my shoreline they'd treated as extensions of their own backyards. The community green space now abruptly ended at a silver wall. The only access left to them was their small official beach, suddenly looking very crowded and inadequate. The aesthetic of lakeside estates, which Brenda had so fiercely guarded, was now irrevocably altered by a barrier of her own making. The irony was exquisite. The fence was defiance made manifest. It was a declaration that my patience was exhausted, and my rights were not negotiable. The messages started coming in that evening, first from Mrs. Henderson, expressing a sort of shocked sympathy, then from a few other neighbors, some angry, some bewildered, a few covertly supportive. The HOA's online forum, I was told, was melting down. The "No trespassing, private property, violators will be prosecuted" signs, professionally printed and citing relevant state statutes, went up the next day, attached to the fence at regular intervals. They were, I thought, a nice touch. Each one was a nail in the coffin of Brenda Koenig's assumed authority over my domain. The 180 fine notice still sat on my desk, but now it looked less like a threat and more like a foolish, impotent relic of a bygone era of arrogance. The immediate aftermath of the fence's completion was a delightful blend of outrage and dawning comprehension within lakeside estates. The visual barrier was absolute. My lake, which had been the centerpiece of their community's perceived value, was now, clearly, unequivocally, visually, mine. And I was not sharing, beyond the narrow confines of their deeded access. The carefully curated illusion of a shared community lake was shattered. Property values, which Brenda and her ilk had often used as a cudgel to enforce their petty rules, we must maintain standards to protect our investments, were now genuinely threatened, not by my fishing, but by the stark reality of their limited access. Homeowners who had paid a premium for lakefront or lake view lots now found their views bisected by chain link, and their frontage ending at a very clear, very unfriendly barrier. The grumbling previously directed at minor HOA infractions now coalesced into a rising tide of discontent aimed squarely at Brenda Koenig and the board. Her aggressive overreach had directly led to this drastic curtailment of a prized amenity. My lawyer, Marcus Thorne, let the situation simmer for a week, allowing the pressure within the HOA to build. Then he launched Phase 3, the counter-offensive. He filed a comprehensive lawsuit in county court. Count 1, declaratory judgment, affirming my sole and exclusive ownership and control of Whisperwind Lake and the specified surrounding lands, seeking to legally nullify any HOA claims or covenants to the contrary. Count 2, damages for harassment, slander of title, due to the false fines and accusations clouding my property rights, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, naming Brenda Koenig personally as well as the HOA as an entity. The 180 fine was Exhibit A in the harassment claim. Count 3, a demand for full reimbursement of all legal fees and survey costs. The filing was a public record. News of it spread through the development like wildfire. Suddenly, the abstract legal notices became a very real, very expensive problem for every homeowner in Lakeside Estates, as they were all de facto members of the defendant HOA. Thorne also began a meticulous investigation into the HOA's formation and its physical assets, specifically the modest building that served as the Lakeside Estates Community Office, where Brenda held court and from which her edicts emanated. Sully, my surveyor friend, proved invaluable again. He unearthed the original development plans and the land lease agreement for the parcel upon which the HOA office stood, and there it was, a beautiful little clause, tucked away in the boilerplate. The small commercial parcel housing the office was leased to the developer, and subsequently assigned to the HOA, by my grandfather's estate for a nominal sum, contingent upon the maintenance of harmonious community relations and continued unimpeded access for Lot 1, my property, to its full riparian and littoral rights. Furthermore, the lease had a 30-year term with an option to renew only upon mutual agreement. That 30-year term had expired 2 years ago. It had simply been allowed to roll over month to month, nobody paying much attention. Until now. Brenda Koenig's aggressive actions in trying to usurp my lake rights, culminating in the outrageous fine and her defiance of my clearly stated ownership, constituted a spectacular breach of harmonious community relations and an attempt to impede my riparian rights. Thorne's eyes gleamed when I presented Sully's findings. "Oh, this is lovely," he breathed. "This is poetic. Not only are we going to win on the lake, but we might just be able to dismantle their command center." He drafted a second notice, this one far more brutal. A formal notification of lease termination for the HOA office parcel due to material breach of covenant and expiration of term, giving them 30 days to vacate the premises and remove all property. It was delivered by a process server to Brenda during an already contentious emergency HOA meeting about my lawsuit. The impact, I was told by Mrs. Henderson, now my most reliable informant, was akin to a small explosive device detonating in the room. Brenda apparently shrieked. The accountant went pale. The civil engineer started openly talking about director liability. The squeeze was on. The HOA was now fighting a two-front war, one to retain illusory control over my lake, and another, far more desperate one, to simply keep the roof over their administrative heads. The sheer audacity of their previous actions was now collapsing under the weight of its own unsupported arrogance. My drone footage, once a defensive measure, now provided a satisfying overview of the growing unease in lakeside estates. Fewer people used the restricted beach. More "for sale" signs began to appear, some discreetly, some defiantly. The fence stood sentinel, a silent testament to the fact that even the most entrenched bully eventually meets an immovable object. And I was very, very immovable. The image of that red envelope, demanding 180, remained my motivator. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle. They had sought to take what was mine, to diminish my legacy, to bully me into submission. They had picked the wrong man and the wrong lake. The legal disembowelment of the Lakeside Estates HOA proceeded with the methodical, unhurried pace of a glacier carving through rock, yet with the undeniable force of an avalanche. Marcus Thorne was in his element. The HOA's initial response to our lawsuit was a flurry of legal motions. Motions to dismiss, motions for summary judgment, all predicated on their increasingly desperate assertion of historic community use, and claims that my deeds were somehow invalidated by the passage of time or the developer's marketing brochures from 30 years ago. Thorne dismantled each argument with surgical precision, citing precedent after precedent affirming the sanctity of recorded deeds and private property rights. His briefs were masterpieces of cold logic, laced with just enough dry wit to make the opposing counsel's arguments look not just weak, but foolish. Discovery was a particularly painful process for the HOA. Thorne's requests for documentation were relentless. All board meeting minutes for the past 10 years, all financial records, all correspondence related to lake management, every complaint ever filed by or against Brenda Koenig. The sheer volume of their own petty tyrannies, now exposed to the harsh light of legal scrutiny, began to work against them. Financial irregularities started to surface, funds diverted from landscaping to discretionary presidential accounts, contracts awarded to friends of board members without competitive bids. Brenda Koenig's carefully constructed facade of civic virtue began to crumble under deposition. Thorne, with his icy calm, expertly led her through a labyrinth of her own contradictions, her blustering self-assurance visibly eroding with each pointed question. Her attempts to portray me as an unreasonable aggressor fell flat against the mountain of evidence, detailing her escalating harassment and the sheer lunacy of the 180 fine for fishing. The unauthorized waterfowl congregation charge became a running joke in Thorne's office. Meanwhile, the eviction notice for the HOA office building hung over them like the sword of Damocles. Their attempts to find alternative premises foundered on their collapsing finances and tarnished reputation. No commercial landlord wanted to touch them. The 30-day deadline approached with alarming speed. On the 29th day, Thorne received a call from a different lawyer, a seasoned litigator from a larger downtown firm, now representing a panicked and fractured HOA board. Brenda Koenig had apparently been sidelined, though not officially removed, as the other board members scrambled to salvage something from the wreckage. The new lawyer was all conciliatory tones and talk of misunderstandings. He proposed a settlement. They would formally recognize my lake ownership, withdraw all fines, issue a public apology, and agree to new, clearly defined rules for their limited beach access. In return, they wanted me to drop my damages claim and, most desperately, allow them to continue leasing the office parcel. Thorne relayed the offer to me without comment, his expression unreadable. I considered it for all of 10 seconds. "No," I said. "On the office, absolutely not. The damages, we can discuss after they've vacated my land. The apology needs to be unambiguous and published in the local paper. And Brenda Koenig needs to resign from the board, permanently." Thorne smiled, a slow, satisfied predator's grin. "My thoughts precisely, Mark. They still think they have leverage. They don't." The deadline passed. On the 31st day, Thorne filed for a writ of eviction. The court, having reviewed the lease agreement Sully had unearthed and the clear breach of terms, granted it swiftly. The sheriff was scheduled to enforce it in 72 hours. News of the impending eviction sent a fresh shockwave through Lakeside Estates. The dream of a powerful, all-controlling HOA was dying, a very public, very humiliating death. The visual of legal filings, summonses, and now a writ of eviction became the dominant on-screen text in my mental cinema of this unfolding drama. Each document was a nail in the coffin of their arrogance. Brenda Koenig, I heard through Mrs. Henderson, was rarely seen outside her house now. The frowny lady was frowning more than ever, but this time her displeasure was directed inward, or perhaps at the collapsing empire she had built on a foundation of sand and spite. The 180-0 demand was now a millstone around her neck, a testament to her hubris. The wheels of justice, though often slow, were grinding exceedingly fine. And they were grinding Brenda Koenig's reign into dust. The day the bulldozer arrived was, I admit, a masterpiece of understated theater. It wasn't a massive, earth-shattering machine, but a tidy, competent piece of equipment, perfectly sized for the task at hand, the removal of one small, very problematic HOA office building from my land. The writ of eviction had been posted. The 72-hour grace period for the HOA to remove their possessions had expired at dawn. A cursory glance through the windows revealed a few scattered files, a sad-looking ficus, and Brenda Koenig's ridiculously oversized president nameplate still on the main desk. They hadn't even bothered to clear it out properly, a final act of petulant neglect. The arrival of the bulldozer trundling down the access road at precisely 8:00 a.m. drew a small crowd of Lakeside Estates residents. They gathered at a respectful distance, their expressions a mixture of shock, dismay, and for a few I recognized as fellow sufferers of Brenda's petty edicts, a kind of grim satisfaction. Brenda herself was notably absent. Perhaps the public humiliation was finally too much even for her. Or perhaps her new, more competent lawyer had strongly advised her to stay away. I stood on my porch, coffee cup in hand, observing. Sarah was beside me, her arm linked through mine. Lily was at school, thankfully spared this rather stark demonstration of cause and effect. The bulldozer operator, a laconic man named Dale, conferred briefly with Sully, who pointed out the exact boundaries of the parcel to be cleared. Then, with a polite nod in my direction, Dale climbed into his cab, fired up the engine, and with a surprisingly gentle nudge, began to dismantle the Lakeside Estates HOA office. The first push took out the flimsy porch. The second collapsed the front wall, revealing the sad little office in all its disarray. There was no malice in the action, just efficient deconstruction. It was, in its own way, a form of cleansing. The building wasn't historic, it wasn't beloved, It was merely the symbol and locus of Brenda Koenig's unpleasant authority. And now, it was being systematically erased. The visual metaphor was almost too perfect. The porch light on my own house, now with an unobstructed view across the newly cleared land towards the lake, seemed to burn brighter. The source of the shadow, the blight on the landscape, was being removed. It took less than 2 hours. By mid-morning, the building was a pile of neatly contained rubble. Dale and his crew even swept the slab clean. He'd be back later with a dump truck to haul away the debris. As the bulldozer fell silent, a peculiar quiet settled over the onlookers. It was the quiet of an ending, but also, perhaps, the quiet of a potential new beginning. Several neighbors, including the accountant and the civil engineer from the HOA board, approached my fence line hesitantly. The accountant, a man named Arthur Jenkins, cleared his throat. "Mr. Markinson," he began, his voice strained, "this is a sobering day." "Indeed, Mr. Jenkins," I replied, my tone neutral. "A direct consequence of choices made." "We understand that now," the civil engineer, a woman named Carol Bellwether, added, painfully. "The board, well, what's left of it, has voted to accept all your terms." Ms. Koenig submitted her resignation this morning. "The apology will be drafted by our counsel and sent to you for approval before publication. We are prepared to discuss damages within our significantly reduced means." I nodded slowly. The fight was over. The primary objectives achieved. The enemy neutralized, their command center literally gone. "The damages," I said, "can be symbolic, provided the apology is sincere and the commitment to respecting my property is absolute. $1, Mr. Jenkins, for the harassment. But my legal fees, Mr. Thorne's fees, those will be paid in full. That is non-negotiable." Relief washed over their faces. The $180 fine, once their weapon, had been turned back on them with interest. But I had no desire to bankrupt my neighbors, only to correct a grievous wrong and ensure my peace. The true cost to them was the loss of face, the loss of their assumed power, and the very real cost of their legal follies. Later that day, a warrant was reportedly issued for Brenda Koenig's arrest. Not for the HOA debacle directly, but for alleged embezzlement of HOA funds. Thorne's discovery process had, it turned out, unearthed a pattern of financial misconduct that the remaining board members, in their desperation to distance themselves from her, had promptly turned over to the district attorney. Her downfall was complete, a textbook case of hubris meeting nemesis. The frowny lady would be frowning in a mugshot. The rubble of the HOA office was more than just debris. It was the physical manifestation of a collapsed tyranny. The air itself felt cleaner. The weeks following the demolition of the HOA office were a period of quiet recalibration for Lakeside Estates and for me. The public apology, vetted by Thorne and remarkably contrite, appeared in the local weekly paper and on what remained of the HOA's online presence. It acknowledged my undisputed ownership of Whisperwind Lake, retracted all previous fines and accusations, and expressed profound regret for the unwarranted actions and distress caused by former leadership. Brenda Koenig's name was conspicuously absent, a silent indictment in itself. My legal fees were paid promptly by the chastened HOA, likely from an emergency assessment on the homeowners. A final, bitter pill for them to swallow, but a necessary one. The $1 symbolic damages for harassment I framed, a small reminder of a very large victory. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now offered tentative waves, sometimes even a sheepish smile. Mrs. Henderson baked me an apple pie. The atmosphere, once thick with Brenda's oppressive oversight, began to lighten. A new interim HOA board was formed, comprising Arthur Jenkins, Carol Bellwether, and a few other residents who seemed genuinely committed to a more reasonable and legally sound approach to community governance. They formally requested a meeting with me. We met, not in an office, but on the cleared land where their former headquarters had stood, the faint outline of the concrete slab, a reminder of what had been. The fence between their common area and my property remained, a stark but necessary boundary. "Mr. Markinson," Arthur began, "we want to start over. We understand fully your rights and the mistakes that were made. We also represent a community that, for better or worse, chose to live here partly because of the lake. We're not asking for a return to the old ways, absolutely not. But we would like to explore the possibility of some form of limited, strictly controlled, and formally agreed upon access to a small portion of the lake, beyond the existing public beach. Perhaps for fishing or kayaking, for residents in good standing. It was a humble request, a world away from Brenda's arrogant demands. I had already considered this. My fight had never been about denying reasonable enjoyment, but about defending against unreasonable aggression and usurpation. The lake was vast. My family and I could not, nor did we wish to, patrol every inch of it forever. A carefully managed access agreement, on my terms, could foster goodwill and ensure the lake's health, perhaps with a modest annual fee per participating household that would go directly into a dedicated fund for lake conservation, managed by a committee including myself. I'm willing to discuss it, I said. Under very specific conditions. Ironclad, non-negotiable conditions regarding behavior, environmental responsibility, and respect for private property. And any agreement would be subject to annual review and immediate revocation for any breach. They readily agreed. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer the harassed resident, but the acknowledged steward of a significant local resource, setting terms from a position of unassailable strength. Sully helped draft the new access agreement, full of precise coordinates, permitted activities, and strict penalties for violations. It was a far cry from Brenda's vaguely worded rules. This was a contract, and it favored the landowner, me. Not all residents were pleased. A few, still smarting from the perceived loss of their rights or loyal to Brenda's memory, put their houses up for sale and left. Good riddance. The neighborhood was, in a sense, purging itself of its more entitled elements. The new lakeside estates would be a quieter, more respectful place. The for sale signs were gradually replaced by sold signs, often to people who were attracted by the clear rules in the end of the HOA wars. The fence remained, a permanent reminder. But a new gate was installed near the old office site, leading to a clearly marked, narrow path to a designated section of shoreline where residents who signed the new access agreement could fish or launch small, non-motorized craft. It was my gate, on my land, and I held the key, both literally and figuratively. The porch light no longer felt like it was guarding against encroachment. It felt like a beacon of well-ordered peace. The lake is quiet again. The rhythmic flick of my fishing line is once more a private meditation, undisturbed by officious pronouncements or the shadow of impending fines. Lily, now a little older, sometimes joins me, her casting technique improving with each outing. She no longer asks about the frowny lady. Brenda Koenig is a receding memory, a cautionary tale whispered among the adults. The 180 demand, that ludicrous monument to arrogance, sits framed in my study, not as a trophy, but as a stark reminder of how easily peace can be shattered and how fiercely it must sometimes be defended. The cost of this victory wasn't measured in dollars, though Thorne's bills were substantial, thankfully covered by the defeated HOA. The true cost was the erosion of my own carefully cultivated tranquility, the months spent in a state of cold, calculated anger, the necessity of transforming a portion of my home, my sanctuary, into a battlefield. There's a scar, an internal one, left by the conflict. It's the realization that even in supposed havens of suburban calm, tyranny can bloom, fed by unchecked power and the apathy of the governed. My actions, while legally sound and morally justified in my own mind, were extreme. Bulldozing a building, even one that represented so much ill, is not a small thing. It's a Rubicon crossed. But they had forced my hand, pushed me from reluctant warrior to a man executing a tactical reclamation of what was undeniably mine. The blood metaphor, as Thorne once dryly put it when discussing the casualties of the HOA board, isn't literal, but the moral weight of such decisive destructive action lingers. It's the understanding that to preserve something precious, one might have to dismantle something offensive with surgical, and at times, brutal, precision. My family is secure. My legacy, the land and water entrusted to me, is reaffirmed. The neighbors, those who remain and the new ones who arrive, understand the boundaries, both physical and behavioral. There's a new respect, born not of fear, but of clarity. The new access agreement for the lake is working, for now. The modest fees collected are managed transparently, funding weed control and water quality testing. I attend the quarterly meetings of the Lake Conservation Committee, my presence a quiet reminder of the new order. The locked gate, the one leading to the newly permitted access point, is more than a physical barrier. It represents psychological closure. It signifies control restored, not through dominance, but through the assertion of legitimate authority. The surveillance drone is mostly retired, its primary mission accomplished. Occasionally, I send it up, a hawk circling in the clear sky, a silent guardian ensuring the peace remains. The power I was forced to wield, the dormant authority I had to awaken, now rests again. But it is no longer entirely asleep. It is vigilant. Fishing is different now. It's still a solace, but it's also a quiet assertion of sovereignty. Every cast is a reminder of the fight, every ripple on the water a testament to the resilience required to protect what one holds dear. The intense, personal battle has ended, leaving behind a landscape altered, both externally and internally. The cold-blooded calm that saw me through the worst of it has settled into a more somber resilience. They thought they could find me into submission for enjoying my own birthright. They learned at considerable expense that some men, when pushed to defend their hearth and heritage, become forces of nature, as implacable and powerful as the very land they seek to protect. And my lake, Whisperwind Lake, finally whispers only of peace.